Hey everyone, Dr. Matt Geller here with Covalent Careers in New Grad Optometry. I'm very lucky to have a great friend of mine, mentor, and fellow colleague, Dr. Brian Chou. Thanks for coming in.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yep. So today we're talking about private equity and how it affects the new grad, or what the new grad optometrist can understand about private equity to be, one, better equipped, more knowledgeable on it, and overall just to navigate the waters a bit better, because ultimately it seems like private equity can certainly affect, and I say that term very broadly, can really affect a new grad in their career.
I started a group practice back in 2011 with my business partner, and our business plan for that practice, which was in a northern suburb of San Diego, was to be in a position to sell it after 5 years. And we did sell that previous practice to a private equity consolidator. So we've kind of lived the private equity experience, and needless to say, within our industry now, it's a very hot topic because there's a tremendous amount of private equity related activity. But there hasn't been as much attention, in my opinion, if any, to the new graduates employed ODs, because it can really have some impacts on their future course.
Yeah, and this really was not a big issue prior to kind of the last, I'd say, 5 years or so.
Yes.
And so, yes, private equity activities were happening, but not to the volume or the timing that they are today.
That's correct. So, private equity has been in all sorts of different industries, but they have really keened in onto ophthalmology and optometry in the past few years. There are literally billions of dollars that are earmarked for acquiring eye care practices. Part of, I think, what needs to be addressed is that there are many new graduates that are, currently working as associates for private practices, and they're getting blindsided because they're finding out that their practice that they're working for is going to sell and be acquired by one of these consolidators, and so they're scared, they don't know what to expect. It can really throw things in for a loop, especially these young ODs that had this concept that, hey, that maybe one day they were going to purchase that practice from the senior OD, and it's just like having the rug pulled from underneath their feet.
Yeah. So let's take a step back here. Can you provide us just the overall, like for those that don't understand, we're using the word private equity.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not just an optometry term,
Right.
Can you give us kind of the 30,000-foot view of private equity?
Yes.
What is it? Maybe even contrast it to venture capital. I think there's some confusion there typically.
Sure.
And then just dive a little bit deeper into the optometry version of private equity and what's going on there.
Yeah, so private equity, it's in an alternative investment. It's basically a capital fund where there are assets that are invested into a business. It's an investment where the management company that takes over the business, they will make changes to it, changes to the operations, the systems, and then usually in about 3 to 5 years, they will sell that business for a multiple of what they paid for it. So you can think of it as a flip in business. And the reason why they're so interested in optometry and ophthalmology is our industry is hyper fragmented. Practices that run very, very differently, and they see a big opportunity to come in and to create systems for using the same electronic medical record, for using the similar products instead of 300 plus different progressive lenses, just a specific type, to use human resource management systems, central billing systems, call centers, and to extract a lot of value and negotiating powers for cost of goods.
Efficiencies as well.
Yes, efficiencies and economies of scale. And so that's what's happening right now.
So there's obviously a good reason for why a lot of docs are selling to private equity at the moment, and we can go into that, but I think what everyone wants to know a bit more is the juicy topic of how much are these practices selling for, and to understand that we need to talk about EBITDA, right, and the multiples upon that. So can you speak to that piece a little bit and educate our viewers a little bit more around what does that mean, and what multiples are they selling for? How does one understand that?
Yeah, so the concept here is that there are many optometrists that are nearing a retirement age and they're looking to sell their practices. They want to maximize the value of their practice, and historically the private equity affiliates have been willing to pay a higher multiple of earnings relative to the traditional optometric sales. So many optometrists historically, they look at the value of their practice as a rule of thumb, about 65% of gross collections as being the sales price. There have been optometric practices that have easily sold for over 100% of
Wow.
gross revenues. The private equity world evaluates practices and businesses differently, though. Instead of using these rules of thumb, they go off of a multiple of earnings. So, income minus expenses and the doctor compensation. So they use a accounting metric called EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, amortization. And so the traditional optometric practice has sold in the past for between 2 to 3 times of EBITDA. And the private equity affiliates, they have no problem coming in paying at least a multiple higher than that, because for them it's a great deal. Other industries, businesses sell for 4 to 7 times EBITDA, so they're thinking, oh gosh, this is a really good deal. And so they don't mind coming in, snatching up these practices, paying a little bit more, because they already have made their money at the time of purchase, knowing what they've bought.
Like most good things, you make your money at the time of purchase, not when you sell. It's all about the price you get it at.
Yes, yeah. So the docs certainly are motivated in part by the prospect of the elevated sales price. Now, many doctors too are motivated by the prospect of reducing their level of stress. They're dealing with non-clinical issues, which many do not find very enjoyable. And the final thing is that there are a lot of new competitive threats on the horizon to private practice optometry. Not only an influx of a lot more graduates, but the technological changes in consumer behaviors of using iPhones and their Android devices to purchase contacts classes, remote examinations, the mail order, contact lens subscription. So it's not only the older optometrists that are looking at the potential of exiting, but even younger optometrists that are in ownership that are contemplating this.
What are some of the good things about private equity and optometry that may be overlooked? And we may just look at this as like, oh, everyone's selling out, everything's changing.
Right.
What are some of the good things that this can bring?
Yeah, I think if it is done properly and right, I think that these consolidators can indeed reduce the stress for the former owners by taking off of their shoulders the burden of these non-clinical issues. It is possible for doctors to end up, after selling, incurring more stress because they may miscalculate on how well trained their staff are afterwards, whether the new electronic medical records that they have to use is as efficient or easy. There may be other factors that can make it harder for them to practice well. If they don't have a cap on the number of patients that they see, and their schedules are super booked up, it can really create more stress. But in terms of other aspects that might be good with the consolidation, the docs that are part of these consolidation networks, they have perhaps greater resources in being able to refer to other ophthalmology specialists within the network, so there may be some more interdisciplinary teamwork, again, if the system is developed properly.
I feel like also one of the pros could be, at the end of the day, what really matters is the patient. Of course, there's our lives too as the OD, but if these large systems do a great job at the efficiencies and economies of scale and can deliver better care, ultimately that can be good for the patient. Now, that's the arguable piece, I suppose, and perhaps that will be the most important thing later down the line, is which one of these groups does it the best and which has the highest patient satisfaction will be interesting to see.
I think so, and from our perspective as optometrists that own, our values are certainly in line with delivering desirable outcomes for the patients and making sure that patient satisfaction is high and we're in existence for a long period of time, in addition to running a successful business. But the core values of the big consolidators is indeed different. Their agenda is not necessarily to bring high patient satisfaction first and foremost. It is to extract value, and if that occurs through cost cutting and increasing volume, all those things are on the table because that is the biological imperative of these private equity affiliates, is to maximize value. It's to make money. It's to sell for a multiple of what they purchased.
Well, thank you for that reality check.
Yeah.
So real quick, before we go into more about how this is going to affect the new graduate, your decision to ultimately sell, right? And then to come back in and start the new practice.
Yes.
What made you want to come back?
Our intent was to stay on indefinitely as employees with the new consolidator that we were part of. But we did miscalculate. Things didn't go as we would have liked. And it became a lot more desirable for us just to re-enter private practice. So that's what we chose to do.
Got it. So onwards, on to kind of the meat of this for focusing on the new grad.
Yeah.
So, you've recently become aware of a couple hairy situations involving new grads and private equity situations. Can you share a few of those stories or one major one?
Right. There have been a number of new graduates, recent graduates, that are working as associates for private practice that have approached me in the past few months because they have found out that their practice is being acquired by one of these consolidators. They don't know what to expect, what their lives are going to look like if they sign these contracts. In some cases, they're being offered equity in the new entity, and they don't fully understand the consequences of it. And these things are critically important, in my opinion. For example, if one of these associates accepts equity in the new entity, at least here in California, when there is a transfer of equity, there is a covenant not to compete, which is enforceable. So it means that after the employed optometrist is part of this new entity, if they leave, they may not be able to practice in a geographic area for a certain amount of time. Unlike if they have absolutely no equity, they're free to work wherever they want. And so if they're not careful, they can really lock themselves out of future opportunities by accepting equity.
Can you provide us kind of like a simple checklist in a way, just starting with the basics to understand if a practice is private equity owned? I mean, what can a new grad do to do their diligence and understand?
Sure. So there are certain consolidation groups that fly under a certain banner, such as my eye doctor, but there are many other consolidation groups where the individual practices still retain their original name, and those may not be as obvious that they're part of corporate ownership.
Yep.
So it ultimately comes down to when these new graduates are interviewing, they should find out who actually runs the show, who owns it. Is it a private OD or is it a corporation that's part of a consolidation? One thing that I think is really important too is if these employed ODs are given these contracts to sign, they need to really be very careful in getting proper counsel in reviewing these contracts. I know a lot of the recent graduates have a tremendous amount of debt, and the last thing that may be on their mind is to spend several $1,000s to have an attorney review these contracts. I think many of these big corporations know that, and they use that to their advantage because the corporations, they have attorneys that are retained and draw up these contracts in a very unfavorable manner to take advantage of the employed optometrists. I feel it is very important to have these documents carefully evaluated in the best interests of these employed optometrists.
So what should they look out for? Say like they're going to go, okay, I'll review this with an attorney, but let me send that attorney some notes in an email of what I, as a new grad, want that attorney to focus on, assuming that maybe they're not the attorney is smart, but maybe not perfectly well versed in it. What should that new grad look out for, or even just OD in general? What should they be looking out for that would be would just be fishy about the situation?
Yeah, I think one thing that is important is just kind of projecting what their workday might look like once things change hands. So, the number of patients they're going to see, are they going to have protections that allow them to limit the number of patients that they see so that they can still feel like they're providing good care? What is their compensation going to look like in terms of, time off, continuing education, professional liability? Is a professional liability policy going to change from a good occurrence-based policy to a claim-based policy with no tail coverage? Is their compensation going to change such that it is more heavily based on production? What happens if the new staff are not as well trained to help the practitioner see as many patients and provide as good care? What if there are systems that come into play under the new entity that don't work as well? For example, if the electronic medical record takes 3 times as many clicks as a previous one, that can create more stress for the practitioner. They may not be as productive. They may not be able to facilitate the revenue per patient. So the equity is a big part too.
Speak on that.
If they're being dangled equity and they accept the equity in the new entity, that can be something that chains them to the consolidator, such that when they do leave, they may not be able to practice in a geographic location anywhere close to any other part of the consolidation network. So they could be locked out of a big geography. So it can be very dangerous for them not to have this document reviewed.
So I think this might be a stupid question, but if I'm thinking it, and I feel like I know this stuff decently well, and it's still popping up, if they're accepting equity in that practice and it's owned by a private equity company, can you paint actually what equity, is that equity of just those books and records of that particular practice, or is that equity in a way linked to the larger entity in any way?
Right.
How does that work? And what if they never decide to sell that one practice? I mean, I feel like that equity is tied up in a way that is different than if it wouldn't be attached to a consolidation private equity-based company. Is that accurate?
Right. Well, the shares would be in the larger entity,
Okay.
So the entire network. And often the private equity investments, the common folks cannot participate in it because you need to be an accredited investor or have connections to to invest. And historically, private equity investments have done very, very well, much better than the normal market. But it gets tricky again when even though there is upside potential for the individuals that take equity, whether it is a selling doctor or an associate that is being dangled equity, perhaps because they wanted to buy from the senior doctor and to appease the associate to make the deal go through, they were actually given some equity. That can chain them to the practice, and in the worst case scenario, it could be the golden handcuffs to a sinking ship if the enterprise fails. The cleanest and safest thing to do is not to accept equity. There is tremendous value in what is currently, the present value, rather than being promised something in the future which you just don't know what it's going to be like.
So you're really getting into very much a business landscape here, and I guess what I'm hearing is, don't judge a book by its cover. Don't be like, oh, I've got equity in this private equity company. Look how cool I am. But really, there's a lot of scary things that come along with that, rather. And maybe that looks more sexy on paper, but more traditional means as well can be equally as valuable, if not more. It's muddy waters, and you've got to really do your due diligence. Are there any questions the OD should ask if a practice is private equity owned? What are the 1 or 2 things that they should ask to know if it's safe to proceed?
I think that's a really good question, because increasingly the opportunities for new graduates are going to come from private equity affiliated practices. These can be very good places to start off and potentially have a longer-term career, knowing that the practice is likely going to change hands every few years, and there may be additional changes that come as part of that territory.
Got it. What if a new graduate is working at a practice that is owned by a private equity company, and then it is flipped again, like you said, in the middle of their term or something like that? What would that new graduate experience if that happens?
I don't know. We really know, but we will probably find out very soon. My understanding is if they have existing contracts that have to persist even and be assumed by any new ownership, those have to be respected. But if it is not formalized, things can change. These employed ODs that are part of practices that are getting acquired by private equity, especially the ones, the ODs that have been part of the practice for a while, they're an important integral part of the practice. And the consolidator, they don't want them to go away, because if the doctor goes away, many patients will also leave. And that is something that these employed optometrists need to bear in mind, is that there is goodwill, and they need to use that to help in their negotiation process. You know, there certainly are recent graduates that are employed that are hesitant to negotiate, because in their mind they think that they're easily replaceable, and they don't fully realize just how valuable they have been to the practice. And that's where it is helpful for them to speak with colleagues that have been through negotiations before, and get in contact with a transactional or employment attorney that is well familiar with this, because the corporations, the consolidators, they're used to doing these negotiations, hundreds of these, whereas, you know, the optometrist might deal with this just a few times during the course of their career.
Yeah, it's a very interesting landscape we're in now. That's news, and we'll see how it plays out for sure.
Yes.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Brian Chou for coming on. Thanks, appreciate it. More content like this to come out. Let us know if you like it. Subscribe to the channel, that whole thing, and more to come into the future. And thank you so much for watching.